Good morning, everyone. We're incredibly excited to share our presentation and findings regarding NATO-Turkey relations. It's been an unprecedented year, but we're looking forward to sharing our thoughts and hearing your perspective on our solutions. This is our team. Casey gave the rundown of everyone in our backgrounds, but I wanted to give a special shout out to Casey here, who truly has been of incredible support during the whole process and helped us truly take our research to the next level. Next, I'll hand it off to Gabriella to discuss the methodology before we dive deeper.
Our research was divided up into three key phases. For phase one, we produced research on what problems NATO and Turkey are facing, as well as other NATO members. For phase two, we had the privilege of interviewing key scholars, including but not limited to Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Ambassador Takan Ildem, as well as former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and Lieutenant H.R. McMaster. For phase three, we created a survey and contacted over 75 scholars in the United States, Western Europe, and Middle East, asking them key questions about the relationship between NATO and Turkey. Our survey included 6 questions, and notably we asked respondents to rank the most pressing issues facing NATO, from most to least threatening to NATO cohesion, as well as what would happen if NATO leaders were to actively mediate between allies engaged in diplomatic or strategic conflicts with Turkey.
After our interviews and analysis, we identified the following 5 areas as the key challenges for the NATO-Turkey relationship: democratic backsliding within Turkey, acquisition of S-400s, the Black Sea and Caucasus, intra-NATO conflicts, and Kurdish militias in Syria. Just as a note, we did not focus on sanctions, as NATO is our audience rather than the US. President Erdogan has increasingly operated with limited democratic checks. This is emphasized through the fact that they are the only NATO ally listed as not free by the Freedom House, receiving a 16 out of 40 for political rights and a 16 out of 60 for civil liberties. This reflects domestic realities in the country that threaten the relationship between other members of NATO, which holds democratic governance as a founding principle of the alliance, and Turkey as well. However, there are concrete actionable policy solutions that NATO member states can encourage and promote within the domestic space in Turkey to ease tensions in the relationship. First, we propose the establishment of the Center of Excellence for Democratic Resilience. Just as referenced in NATO 23, which addresses the ways NATOs can efficiently operate in the future, NATO can establish this center to support and strengthen local democratic institutions within Turkey. It would also signal to other countries that Turkey is still invested in values tied to NATO. Next, a joint condemnation of the Uyghur camps in China would assist in revitalizing NATO-Turkey relations, as well as a signal to Turkey's commitment to NATO institutions and democratic values. This is boiling into a major domestic issue within Turkey, where opposition leaders utilize national pride in Turkish identity to increase opposition to Erdogan's rule. Condemning the Uyghur camps would not only signal a further commitment to human rights, it would also improve Erdogan's standing within Turkey, distancing Turkish interests from China and mend NATO relations. Finally, we propose offering economic benefits and more trade deals to Turkey through the EU to pressure Turkey when it comes to human rights violations. Over the years, Erdogan has cracked down on protests, attacked journalism, altered the judicial structure, and much more. Economic incentives would pressure Turkey to compromise on some anti-democratic actions. One example would be to comply with the European Court of Human Rights ruling to release Osman Kavala, a prominent philanthropist and civil society activist. This would signal Turkey's commitment to protecting human rights and help the NATO-Turkey relationship. I'll pass it off to Zuha, who will be speaking about S-400s.
Hi everyone, my name is Zuha and I will be discussing the Turkish acquisition of the Russian S-400. So in our interviews with experts from both sides of the issue, the question of S-400 naturally stood out. Among the experts on Turkish and NATO policy we surveyed, a significant plurality, 36% of respondents considered it to be the most significant threat to a NATO cohesion. Turkey's decision to turn to Russia instead of agreeing to contract for the American Patriot missiles dealt a major blow to its security partnership with NATO. So in this regard, the justificatory position of the parties is very divergent, which has resulted in an impasse. While the official Turkish position remains that it was not made an offer that matched its security requirements, we found that the US asserts that it was willing to share its price system with Turkey, despite the latter being engaged in negotiations with first China and then Russia. In addition to that, there is domestic pressure on both Turkey and the United States from the political opposition when it comes to the S-400 system. So friction is inevitable in this policy priority area, but we offer 3 key recommendations to address it. So firstly, it is important to de-link the question of S-400 from other problems present between Turkey and NATO. We offer this recommendation because there is a strong tendency for this issue to appear in the path of resolution towards other problems the relationship is facing. We stress on the need to compartmentalize these problems such that there aren't unnecessary hurdles created when other issues, where there is a greater possibility of reconciliation, are being discussed. Secondly, we suggest engaging in a dialogue to outline a plan for the missile systems now that Turkey has acquired the S-400. Interoperability is out of question. Both NATO and the US have made this clear. We also recognize the sheer tension surrounding negotiations because of the gravity of the matter, but we break it down to show that these tensions are not insurmountable. So firstly, these talks should be of a technical nature. When NATO or the US assert that interoperability is out of question, at this stage, they should not be basing it on geopolitical reasons. Rather, they should look to technical problems that render it impossible to have a situation where both systems are operated side by side and there isn't a threat of Russian espionage. Next, these negotiations should be carried out by technical experts to try and separate the political content of the issue and focus on technicalities. So if Turkey can be convinced that interoperability is not technically feasible, there isn't a political triumph on either side, rather a diplomatic win for NATO. Here, politicians should obviously resist the temptation to pursue political ends through this dialogue. Lastly, this dialogue should be private, and as we have mentioned repeatedly in our policy memo as well, megaphone diplomacy is not going to be very helpful here. Because the intent is not to send anyone a message of triumph, but to seriously work out a problem to salvage this critical alliance, we stress on the need to have a private dialogue. It also gives Turkey and the US room to navigate how to present the solutions to public, to their respective oppositions, and of course to Russia. Lastly, we recognize the need for NATO to show flexibility and offer alternatives too, so if it hopes for Turkey to cooperate in these negotiations. A few things that can be done in this area. We mentioned a proposal presented in the US Senate that talks about purchasing the S-400 systems from Turkey. This would alleviate the financial pressure Turkey is domestically facing from its parliament, which approved the purchase, and would also give NATO access to Russian technology. Other alternatives could include offering additional military support to Turkey to strengthen its security while working together to dispose of the systems. Ideally, this may also involve Turkey granting access to NATO to Russian technology, but this will only be possible if such a desire is matched by an offer that satisfies Turkey's security-based and financial concerns. I would just end by mentioning that a hardline approach has not worked with President Erdogan and is not likely to do so in the future either. So the focus of these recommendations is to work cooperatively to find a solution. I am now going to turn it over to Sam, who will talk about some areas of reconciliation with regards to the Turkish-Russian relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuha. Clearly, we have identified a number of serious challenges that could be impediments to future NATO-Turkey cooperation. But we also believe that in light of various geopolitical developments regarding Russia, there are new opportunities for NATO to exploit. These are places where Russia and Turkey favor divergent outcomes. And we're thinking of 3 regions where we think this is very apparent. First of all, in the Black Sea, second of all, in the Caucasus, and third, in Libya. We're going to focus on the first 2. We've identified 4 policy recommendations that we think address these places where Russia and Turkey favor divergent outcomes in the Black Sea and the Caucasus. And accordingly, these are places where we think NATO can work to better integrate and better ensure that Turkey is a strong part of the alliance despite these differences elsewhere. So the first of these recommendations is the creation of a permanent Black Sea maritime patrol. There's a couple things that influence our idea that this is an important recommendation. First of all, Turkey and Ukraine have deepened their bilateral relationship since the Russian actions in Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine in 2014. This has been most prominent in the forms of various meetings, bilateral meetings, and arms deals between these two countries. At the same time, Turkey is also deeply concerned about the possibility of Russian dominance in the Black Sea. And so Turkish-Ukrainian cooperation is one way that Turkey has already started to try and work against the possibilities of Russian dominance in the region. And we think that NATO should leverage this bilateral cooperation to form this permanent Black Sea maritime patrol that would integrate the capacities and capabilities of both NATO member states and non-member states like Ukraine. And a good blueprint for this could be the ongoing NATO operations in the Mediterranean Sea. And the key would be to begin really just by providing low visibility but active support, that is NATO providing such support, to form the joint Turkish-Ukrainian patrols. And over time, this could build upon pre-existing NATO deployments, including the positioning of U.S. naval assets and Spanish fighter aircraft to the Black Sea region just this past January. And by initially framing these patrols as an outgrowth of bilateral Turkish-Ukrainian relations, NATO allies would be empowering Turkey to lead this Black Sea patrol, helping to further embed Turkey in the alliance. That's our first recommendation. Our second recommendation comes out of our various conversations with experts. And time again, we heard about the emphasis that the Turkish government and the current Turkish leadership place on the situation, the human rights situation in Crimea with regards to the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars are this Muslim, Turkic-speaking ethnic group with a long history of facing state-sanctioned persecution. And the Crimean Tatar community has been vocally opposed to the Russian occupation of Crimea, and that has led to an intense and well-documented campaign of persecution carried out by Russian authorities. Turkish diplomats at multilateral venues like the UN Human Rights Council have spoken out on a number of occasions against the Russian treatment of this ethnic minority. And it's this vocal support for the Crimean Tatars has even impacted the Russo-Turkish bilateral relationship. And so we recognize that NATO is not a human rights organization, but NATO does have a well-established means of condemning Russian transgressions of basic human rights protections. We can look at statements NATO has issued since in the aftermath of the poisoning of the Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. And the point here is that taking a public stand against the persecution of the Crimean Tatars can not only help to raise the international profile of the issue, but can also help to further drive a wedge between Russia and Turkey. Now, the key caveat here is this needs to be done carefully to avoid any appearance of hypocrisy, given human rights concerns in Turkey and the position of many NATO allies on that issue. But we still think that this is a place where narrow Turkish foreign policy interests align with the broader NATO mission, and this is a good example of the types of policies that NATO should pursue as it looks to reinforce Turkey's position within the alliance. Our third Our third recommendation takes us from the Black Sea to the Caucasus. Now, at first glance, this may seem counterintuitive because the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan just a few months ago demonstrated many of the divisions that exist within the alliance. Turkey provided Azerbaijan with immense material support, and the French President Emmanuel Macron vocally condemned Azerbaijan's military efforts and spoke out against this Turkish assistance. Even so, I actually think that the recent conflict over the fate of Nagorno-Karabakh further highlights the important role that NATO can play in the former Soviet sphere. Despite the existence of numerous post-Soviet territorial disputes across Eastern Europe, NATO expansion following the end of the Cold War has played a crucial role in ensuring that the newly independent nations did not pursue these sorts of aims. Though further NATO enlargement, especially in the Caucasus region, seems politically infeasible, deepening NATO engagement with Armenia and Azerbaijan may prove an important step toward ultimately settling this territorial conflict between these two nations. Even if the resolution of this dispute seems unlikely in the near future, increasing the quality and quantity of NATO's partnerships in the Caucasus is important given Russia's renewed role in the region. Such engagement, though complicated by internal NATO divisions, would certainly require Turkish support. As previous Azerbaijani participation in NATO operations under Turkish command demonstrates, Turkey can serve as a useful conduit for NATO engagement with Azerbaijan. To ensure that cooperation with Azerbaijan and Armenia accounts for the political sensitivities of member states, partnership programs should focus on defensive capabilities and disaster relief capacities. This can be modeled upon pre-existing patterns of partnership. NATO already cooperates with both Azerbaijan and Armenia on emergency preparedness and disaster response issues. Similarly, NATO has supported cyber defense initiatives in Azerbaijan and the disposal of decommissioned military equipment in Armenia. Leveraging Turkey's ties to Azerbaijan and the ties of other member states to Armenia could help to determine what additional projects NATO can support, and ensuring that these projects are undertaken simultaneously in both nations could help militate against objections from certain member states. Finally, our last recommendation relates more broadly to Turkish army building expertise. So Azerbaijan's success in this most recent conflict in part reflects the effectiveness of the support that NATO has provided partner nations. Azerbaijan has participated in NATO partnership programs since it achieved independence, and Azerbaijani forces have operated under Turkish command in NATO military operations in Kosovo and Afghanistan. Though member states such as France may be concerned regarding Azerbaijan's recent military successes, the developments in the Caucasus are proof positive of the effectiveness of NATO partnership programs. In light of the role of Turkish army building in securing Azerbaijan's military successes, NATO members should look to further engage Turkey by leveraging this expertise, right? NATO already has ongoing training missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and with the African Union, and NATO allies should integrate Turkish knowledge and best practices into these missions. This expertise would also be useful in furthering NATO's efforts to confront a resurgent Russia, bolstering its cooperation programs and partner nations in Eastern Europe and across the former Soviet Union.
Thank you, Sam. There is perhaps no intra-allied dispute between Turkey and another member of NATO that is more long-standing and threatening than the relationship between Turkey and Greece. In the Eastern Mediterranean Sea region, there are three principal areas of dispute between these two allies. First, each makes conflicting sovereignty claims over islands and waters in the Aegean Sea. Second, they've made conflicting claims regarding their respective exclusive economic zones, which are especially fraught by the presence of undersea gas reserves in the region. Third, the two countries support opposing governments on the island of Cyprus. Underlying these disputes is an array of economic, political, and historical factors that have made them a near constant rift in the NATO alliance since both states became members in 1952. While it's important to acknowledge the intractability of these issues, there remains the possibility of progress, and we think that NATO's leaders can help play an important role. By way of framing our recommendations in this area, I want to highlight some of the results of our survey of policy experts. Notably, there seems to be a consensus of experts on this topic. There was a relative absence of extreme responses assigning or absolving either Turkey or Greece of blame for the tension between the two allies in the Eastern Mediterranean. We see this as a sign that despite the intractability of these disputes, the possibility remains that both sides can be brought to the table and progress can be made toward their resolution. The hopeful sign among experts studying the topic influenced our recommendations' emphasis on facilitating dialogue and cooperation between Greece and Turkey through the framework of NATO. Worth noting that NATO has already been involved in promoting military deconfliction between Greece and Turkey in the region in the past. Most recently, the deconfliction mechanism established by Secretary General Stoltenberg in late 2020 offers a model for continued engagement that is centered around the principal objective of preventing a military clash between the two allies. In addition to sustaining these military deconfliction activities, we recommend that NATO takes 2 further steps to help facilitate a diplomatic resolution to the multiple disputes between Turkey and Greece. First, NATO's leaders can attempt to provide more opportunities for Turkey and Greece to come together and discuss their differences. In addition to supporting more informal mechanisms of discussion within the NATO structure, NATO should consider establishing a permanent inter-ally dispute committee where any ally can articulate its position in the myriad disputes that arise between member states. Critically, this venue would allow for inter-ally disputes to be constructively entered into broader NATO discussions outside of full meetings of the North Atlantic Council. The committee would be charged with evaluating internally disputes' impacts on NATO operations and provide a designated venue for states to have a sustained dialogue on areas of disagreement. Secondly, NATO should consider offering alliance membership to a unified Cyprus as a means of pushing along the negotiation process between the island's 2 governments. NATO membership could help mollify the security concerns of both Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Should the unification process negotiations continue to fail, NATO's leaders should also consider establishing a NATO presence on the island anyway. There would likely still be benefits to the security of both governments and the stability of the island as a whole. Care must, of course, be taken to ensure that Greek and Turkish soldiers operating under the authority of NATO do not clash with each other, but a presence in Cyprus may be worth risks. There's also a strong strategic rationale for a NATO presence in Cyprus given its geographic position, especially if the Biden administration pursues a substantial drawdown in the US military presence in the Middle East. While these recommendations represent only a starting point for the resolution of the long-standing disputes between Turkey and Greece in the Mediterranean, we hope that NATO engagement will prove to be an effective catalyst for substantive progress. Now, Gabriella is going to discuss another inter-ally dispute between Turkey and another member state that was particularly salient among Turkish experts in our research.
Across our research, we have identified the U.S. relationship with Kurdish militias in northern Syria as a major concern and fracture in the NATO-Turkey relationship, most prominently in Turkey's perspective. Now, Turkey seems inflexible and distressed with the U.S. relationship with the People's Protection Units, aka the YPG. The YPG is a militant wing of the Kurdish national group known as the Democratic Union Party, also known as YPD, in northern Syria. YPG has links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which Turkey and the US have both declared as a terrorist organization. However, Turkey wants NATO to take a more direct position in labeling the YPG as a terrorist group. Now, in Turkey's perspectives, the YPG and PKK threaten Syria's future, including its territorial integrity, unitary structure, but these organizations also threaten the national security of Turkey. The U.S. has provided steadfast military support for the YPG with military supplies and training, and the U.S. has backed YPG in their fight against ISIS. In 2020, the U.S. Defense Department allocated $200 million to the YPG PKK for an anti-Daesh mission. Apart from military support, the U.S. provided $1.2 million recently in COVID-19 prevention efforts to the YPG and PKK. This is a critical fracture in the alliance from Turkey's perspective because Turkey feels, and many Turkish officials that we've interviewed have echoed the sentiment, that NATO is failing to address Turkey's domestic and security concerns. Back in 2019, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said, quote, "While Turkey has legitimate security concerns, I expect Turkey to act with restraint. We have a common enemy, Daesh." Broadly, in NATO and U.S. perspectives, working with the YPG and PKK is for a greater goal, and that is fighting terrorism in the region, including training local forces so that they are equipped to fight terrorism. Right now, we have just one key recommendation for this matter, which is private dialogue on the YPG and affiliate groups. Now, we recognize that NATO members, the U.S. and Turkey all have compelling domestic interests that guide international affairs. NATO members all have different stances and views as to whether YPG is a terrorist organization. A number of European countries have not declared YPG as a terrorist organization, and the US has worked with YPG to fight against ISIS in Syria. As previously mentioned, one Turkey NATO official strongly advised against megaphone diplomacy, which leads us to consider private dialogue more closely. With the new Biden administration and the prospects of the U.S. gradually pulling out of the Middle East, we see private negotiations at an executive level to be the first step in long-term solutions. It will signal to Turkey that their demands and domestic interests are being heard and considered, while opening the conversation to how the U.S. and NATO can compromise in some areas, and maybe even offer concessions.